Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 885. Just a merely 15 left until the 900. Let's go for a celebration. We are also approaching the millennia. What do you say about that? It's rather amazing. And we are talking about an observer participant now. And is this article from Susie Froebel, the German physicist who's written about fractal time. And I continue in her little article, and we are talking about the observer participants. I'm just going to check my sugar level. Just give me a sec here. Sorry about that. It's going downwards. I hope we can event this. As observer participants, that is not being in time, we have no access to the noumenon and face a limit to conscious introspection of the prerequisites which constrain our perceptions. Given these limitations, a phenomenological approach which focuses on the world observer interface is a promising starting point. The ideas and assumptions presented in this start therefore refer to an interface reality, and that is the boundary which embraces both the observer participant and the environment he interacts with. Particular emphasis is given to the notions of the observer's now, an extended and structured interval which defines the observer's event horizon. As Rössler put it, nowness is pure interface. And think of it as two surfaces interacted. This is taken for the vantage point of space, and once observing a fractal space, you have to also understand that the thing observing is fractal as well. And that changes everything. Usually we have this idea of the origo or the vantage point that is doing the observation is somehow left out of the picture. So it could be a pure origo or a pure noumena of the vantage point just making a pure seeing. But that is not really the point. Also, the observer participant is fractal, and that changes everything. So see the whole thing as this. When you look into something, let's call this the subject, and this is the object you look into. This is the observer, this is the observed. Both are fractal. So you have these rugged surfaces interacting into each other. No longer is this static idea of an observer, but it's not only not static. It's something else. It's fractal as well. And the same thing goes with time. When we have a fractal time, also the consciousness is fractal. I think this can be made the most clear if you take into context the now. The now is usually fossilized or made static as the the I of presence, this eternal standpoint, which is not fractal. It's more like a point consciousness, or I think that's a very good way of putting it. It's a point consciousness that doesn't have any extension in the way of being fractal or having any dimension. This point consciousness constructs the object outside, since it doesn't have any extension, any width, it doesn't have an extension in time, and it doesn't have any depth. It constructed this very short take called the now presence. The very way we generate succession, simultaneity, and our now with a capital N is not a trivial matter. Well, I think you understood that by now. Our perceptional constraints determine whether we experience a visual, auditory, or tactile sensation as one event, or as a number of successive ones. An auditory event spans a shorter interval than a tactile one or a visual one. So we experience several modes of perception in parallel as a temporal nested pattern, which forms our now. The now is therefore not a point which divides the past from the future, but an extended field which hosts a structure of temporally nested events, a fractal. And this is very important. The very idea of nested events means that retention and protension goes into each other in a nested event, which is the now. It's looking a bit like this. The old picture has this point consciousness. Point consciousness is a bit of not knowing. It has not been lightened up by knowledge. We haven't looked into it. So point knowledge or a point now is a not knowing. It's a lack of knowledge, is a lack of skill in understanding what a now is. So it's not a thing as such. It will, however, if we put our consciousness, our thinking into it, turn out to be something widely different from this point consciousness. And that is something that has an extension in time. And this is widening and deepening. And this is also corporal widening and deepening. Getting into the very thing. Sorry, I'm getting nauseous here. My blood sugar level is actually hitting the bottom. And that one quick. I have another candy here. This will be the last one, I promise. Oh yeah. The first one to describe such a nested structure now was the German phenomenologist Edmund Husserl. And of course he could not refer to the term fractal, as this treatise appeared some 80 years before Mandelbrot's seminal book. What he did was to ask the simple question as to why we are able to perceive a tune as opposed to a series of unrelated notes. He concluded that this must be so because we remember the note we have just heard, retention, and assuming that this was not all, anticipate the next note, which is protension. In our consciousness of the present, the know. Every know embeds the preceding one, including its differentiated structure of retention and pretension, i.e. the memories of the notes that we played and those we anticipate to follow. This leads... Oh, hallå där. Shit, jag får väl in jobb. This is the beaded or nested now, and this is quite sharply different from the non-extended origo, like the idea of the here in space is not extended, it doesn't have any depth, it's just a point where you look onto the world, whereas it has to be in reality something fractal, extended with depth. So rather this leads to a nesting cascade of nows, each hosting both retentions and pretensions. The current now forms the framework time into which all previous and expected events are embedded, thus generating a fractal structure. Otherwise, we will be in a situation where all notes were completely unrelated. There would be no connection, no glue, so to speak, to construct a whole melody or a tune that is longer than a millisecond, or not even that, could be a nanosecond, or the shortest movement that is possible, the very, very ångström of movement. But this is not what we experience. So the origo flies into the face what is real. The reality is that we take in both the beginning of a tune, the end of the tune, and the now of the tune at the very same time. And thereby you see that a tune has dimensionality built into it. So we are able to perceive both succession and simultaneity at the very same time. So the foundation of this is called something either nested now or what we call fractal time. And this provides a means of quantifying the internal structure of the observer's interface by differentiating between the length of a time, which is called delta t length, the depth of time, which is called delta t depth, and the density of time, which is called delta t density. These concepts allow us to describe our temporal interfaces as nested temporal perspectives. Delta t length is measured in the number of incompatible events in a time series, i.e. events which cannot be expressed in terms of duration relation, that is simultaneity. It defines the length of time and the temporal dimension of succession of individual LODs. Delta depth is measured in the number of compatible events in time series, i.e. events which can be expressed in terms of during relations. It defines the temporal dimension of simultaneity for two or more LODs. Delta T density is the fractal dimension of time series. It measures the density of time, i.e. the relation between successive and simultaneous events. So what we have is succession, we have length, and we have depth. By combining those, we get a density of time. This could be compared to this cone. Cone is used to show that the further up you come, the bigger the density becomes, the weight of the whole thing. It is combining. Actually, there is a fractal clock always built, already built. There we have fractal time as it looks, and here we have the Prague Orloj, which is a fractal clock. And it's built around 1410 in Prague. It shows several nested timescales, minutes, hours, days and months, as well as the night sky throughout the year, the ascent and setting of the stars, the lengths of the days and nights throughout the year, the moon phases and the festive days. It also shows Bohemian Time. Bohemian Time is what we call the ship time in Sweden, and it's that you divide the day from morning, sunrise, to sundown, and you divide those into 6 parts, and you also divide the night into 6 parts. An alternative is to divide it into 12 parts. This makes more sense on a ship. A ship is structured according to day and night, and it wouldn't make any sense to have a clock time that is structured on the moon or something similar. You need to know the working hours you have when sailing. The nested structure of the now is the result of a fractal temporal structure within the observer and his environment. And once more, this is in sharp contrast to the point origin of observation, which is an impossibility. And I think that is constructed by our blindness to where observations stem. This blindness is what I call a point observation, but it's not really a point. It's an impossibility. It's coming from us not looking deeper into this. So it's not an idea, it's not an opinion, it's a lack of knowing, and that is quite different. One needs understanding to accept it. There is no convincing here, no arguments would work to actually show the idea, because it has to be in your consciousness, it has to be working, and that's very, very different from an argument, from criticism, which doesn't serve the purpose. Actually, argument and criticism very seldom serve any purpose other than in public debate or maybe some fun after work thing where you have a couple of beers or such. But this really needs to work, and it could work, and it is working partly in everyone. So this is a possibility. But to understand, both sides needs to come into the equation. And if the point of origin is also fractal, it's not, I don't think it's that hard to understand. This is radically different from only looking at this side, the outside side, or as I mentioned it before, objective time. But objective time is not really objective because we disregard this part. Do you understand? It can never be objective. So the claim that objective time sort of make is an impossibility. It has always been an impossibility. It will always be an impossibility. Further, we also have to add that our sensory perception also is fractal. Pöppel showed in his neuroscientific approach how our perceptual constraints create a simultaneity horizon at which we perceive audio and visual signals as occurring simultaneously, which is not possible if you look at perception as such. We perceive audio signals as non-simultaneous if they are separated by an interval of roughly 6 milliseconds. If that separating interval is shorter, we perceive audio signals as being simultaneous. Visual impressions, which are separated by an interval of 20 to 30 milliseconds, are experienced as non-simultaneous. Below this threshold, impressions are perceived as simultaneous. The simultaneity threshold for tactile impressions lay at approximately 10 milliseconds. Thus, we perceive tactile, visual and audio events as temporally nested, since the interval which defines them as one event rather than two successive ones varies for each sensory realm. According to Pöppel, this temporally nested structure is perceived as one now if we have a clustering of perception-related experience which are based on meaningfulness, i.e. perceptual gestalts which are constructed by our brains. He does not refer to a nested refractal structure, but this example implicitly describes a fractal perspective. Thus, the extension of the now depends on the mental capability of the person who experiences an event. And that's another interesting feature. When we have this mistaken belief in an objective time, we always disregard the subjective side, like if it were possible. Once we understand that the subjective part has to come into the equation, we will also understand something other which is most important, and that is it always varies in level. It is ludicrous to say that everybody has the same level of perception. It must be a skill because it's so complicated and it's under only one direction, our intention. So it's always different, and the levels of perception is levelized, hierarchized. So we're not equal in perception. We could even say we're not equal in reality. And this is something no social equality or economical equality can take away. It's how everything is constructed. So you see a little bit how the French Revolution goes hand in hand with the idea that the world is only one similar thing. But I would say the most important thing in this is that you have to understand objective time is in itself an impossibility. Always. It is. There is no non-fractal unit in the universe who could perceive such a world. and it will not come into existence before it has been perceived. So it's once more a rather complicated way to show the difference between ontic and ontological. And ontic, once more, is jumping one step. It's not a different approach. It's a clumsiness within the ontological. So the ontological is the wider, more encompassing structure or way of seeing it. And therein the ontological a mistake is made, and you get stuck in the ontic mode. An extended now requires both the identification and integration of perceptual gestalts, which, in terms of fractal time, may be denoted as nestings of meaningful events. And memory, the nesting cascade of nows with the current one. The measuring rod for the now is thou situated within ourselves. The temporal extensions of events, which may be turned into perceptual gestalts by means of integration. Therefore, we may say that a complex observer perceives a complex environment in a decomplexified manner. The observer-participant degree of fractality determines the temporal complexity of the world he generates. You can have individual perceptions exactness at the same time as you have a global knowledge. I think that is the message from fractality. It is a necessity, it is that way. Once more, I'll have to repeat iteration. That understanding a Fern or a Urenbunke, for instance, means understanding it in its detail, which is the same as the whole. And you can do both at the same time. Actually, it's necessary to see the small fine details or understand them perceptually, time-wise, and also as a whole, time-wise, perceptually. And that is the Gestalt. And for us, there is a contradiction there usually. And that contradiction stems from the idea of different scales, and they are excluding each other. We can't both see the fine details as we see the global picture, and that is absolutely wrong from a fractal perspective. It's absolutely wrong. It's not often you can say that, but this is a good hint. It's not correct that specific details exclude wholeness. They complement each other, and they're both necessary to understand everything. So the totality needs both detail and globalism. I will also shortly mention the extended observer, and now it's getting rather complicated. This is when observation goes beyond what we usually say is within perception range. And this is because of the fractality of reality. It's not as easy to say where is the limit for understanding and perception. It goes beyond that because of the fractality. She writes like this in paragraph number 4. We are now page 10. Hitherto I refer to the observer participant in an unspecific manner, without defining the boundary which limits him. But the question as to where we may set the interfacial cut between the observer and the rest of the world is crucial for our reality generation game. But deciding what we assign as being part of the observer and what as being part of the rest of the world is a tricky matter. This is something we've been into very much when it comes to space, and that is a fixed position between the observer and the observed is something that easily can be proved to be very difficult to be sure of or attain. It seems more to be a moving thing within space. When it comes to time, it is not exactly the same. Well, it's explained in another way because it's time we're talking about. And she's coming to that in this next line. Misattribution are common and often not easily identified as such by introspection or reasoning. Simple conditioning effects can turn individuals into extended observers. The famous example of the rubber hand illusion illustrates this nicely. In 1998, Botvinnik and Cohen conducted an experiment in which a person is sitting at a table with his left arm resting on it. His other hand is screened off from view and a rubber hand is placed in front of him. Next, he is asked to look only at the rubber hand, while both the rubber hand and his own hand, which is hidden from view, are stroked with paint brushes simultaneously. The visual feedback linked to the observer's visual and tactile perception, so that after a while he reported that he felt his own hand was being stroked when only the rubber hand was touched by the paintbrush. The intermodal matching sufficed for self-attribution. This conditioning effect, neurons that fire together wire together, change his perspective by shifting the location of the interfacial cut between the observer and the rest of the world. So we are a fractal and we perceive fractality in a fractal way, and fractal dimensions easily explain this rubber hand illusion as not being an illusion at all. Actually, it's a part of reality, and the pain inflicted if you hit it with a hammer is real pain. So the old model with a very clear-cut division between us and the world doesn't hold. But there is still a line to be made, but that line is fractal. It's not needle or point-like. Neither is it points after another. And I think this is very similar with time. We think of linear time as many, many, many points, and they're so close together they make up a line. This is not the case. One way we explain that when it comes to space, there's no such a thing like a straight line. But in time, another way of looking at that is that when time evolves, it can only do so when there is a fractal observer and a fractal environment. That's an absolute necessity. And the lines that are constructed that are somewhat dissimilar to other lines.